So yeah, obviously want to first just like welcome you, but also thank you for the work you've done in terms of like engaging people on the many fronts of environmental protection and climate action, but also like greening the economy. Let's say like decarbonizing the capitalist economy. But I wanted to start with like an acknowledgement that this is a pivotal year for democracy in a
Mhm.
lot of ways. Um, in thinking about the struggle for climate action, like I do constantly come back to, uh, in a way, like the question of like how healthy democracy is,
Mhm.
which it seems like it's struggling, right? um, in 2024, though, the Energy Mix reports that more than 4 billion people will be able to vote in over 50 national elections
Mhm.
around the world. So it's a big year,
Totally.
and a lot could change. But do you feel, as an activist, that democracy is still a force for like making sure that everybody's represented
Mm.
when it comes to addressing the impacts of climate change, what needs to be done? Or, is democracy here in Canada, let's say, too sort of like limited,
Mm.
too tied up in elections for it to be like a thing that people feel connected to or feel empowered by?
That's a really interesting way to start. I think immediately kind of two threads come to mind. The first one is how much our democracies are extremely weak right now, and how, as much as I genuinely believe and would fight for healthy democracies, and even though sometimes that would take longer to achieve climate action than non-democratic places, I would still fight for a democracy, and want to make sure that, too bad if the climate action isn't popular, then we'll have to craft a policy that is popular, and we'll have to craft a messaging that reaches people. However, I feel like we're in a place where democracies are weak, partially because they're being, abused. They're definitely uh, between industries and people in power, people that want power, whether it's domestically or abroad, who are trying to find the cracks in our democracy and really exploiting them. And I'm, especially because I'm Gen Z and grew up with social media, extremely worried about how our mainstream institutions are underestimating what's happening on social media in terms of undermining democracy and fueling, apathy so I think we're in weak democracies, which is even worse for climate action, because we're really not able to, even when we know there's a popular consensus around the need for climate action, then we're not able to see that result in good legislation or good policy. And so I think that's the first one. And the second one, I like the fact that you talked about, are we too focused on elections? Because that is something that I see occasionally um, in the climate movement, is we will basically be focused on the next election, and perhaps, lend so much of our, most talented campaigners, so much of our resources to elections, often to fight for candidates or ideas that we wouldn't put that much resources otherwise if it wasn't part of an election. So, we're really ready to fight for a candidate that's championing quite mediocre ideas, just because we've bought into this idea of, sometimes it's preventing another party from getting in, sometimes so I really see a waste, and I think I'd be curious to see people who are doing a bit more, long-term planning about where do we need to be to have candidates that really represent us, and perhaps otherwise, like how we could, no matter who's in power, secure some climate wins, because we've done the right amount of like coalition building, where everybody that has something to gain from climate action, which really is everybody except the fossil fuel industry, so
Mhm.
where everybody that has something to gain is ready to fight for it no matter who's in power.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, like last point, especially because it just it helps me understand something that I'm still constantly kind of working to reconcile myself with, right? Because, like, here in Canada, it's not to get too sort of partisan, it's the possibility of Pierre Polyev and his stated kind of like kind of not denialist position, but almost a climate denialist position, or at least one that says, profits matter more in the present, economic like growth matters more than long-term like stability in the climate system, right? Like that kind of
Mhm.
just
That's right.
myopia, basically.
And for now, we've seen no climate plan from that party, and
Right.
or recently, and we've seen no climate plan aligned with the targets. So for sure,
Hmm.
I'd say that it's not proposing anything that's credible on climate so far.
Yeah, so I mean, like in the face of that very real kind of threat of a rollback of like all of the gains that have happened at kind of like institutional levels, it's like it would be easy to just be overwhelmed by it and almost fall into a level of passivity or whatever. Like, if not passivity, then feeling bested by this electoral cycle where it's always swinging back and forth between the liberals and conservatives, seemingly no matter what we do. But this other option gives us more agency, which is like coalition building, recognizing that no matter who is in power, you have enough strength, resilience, solidarity to like get things done. But the other thing I wanted to kind of pick up on is this idea that you said, like, if the policies aren't popular, craft more popular policies.
Yeah.
Like that's so smart to me because I was reading this stuff by the Climate Narratives Initiative,
Mhm.
right? It says climate communicators who actually want to move people to join the cause have to provide audiences with tangible, specific examples of climate solutions to counter the sense that we're helpless in the face of the climate crisis. When you're working to shift things to craft popular policies, do you feel like people are getting it, especially in
Mhm.
terms of trying to convince people that aren't already active members of the climate movement that it works, that it makes sense, that there are benefits, and that it's urgent?
Mhm. Look, I think that's right. Like there's kind of two problems with the moment we're in with climate. There is this communication problem. There is the fact that sometimes people will be against a climate policy that is in fact beneficial to the majority. And I think that the carbon tax has been, written about 1,000 times over. And I think personally, I think we've wasted a whole lot of political capital on it. But at this stage, we know
Mm.
that it benefits the vast majority of Canadians, and
Yeah.
still so there is that communication issue for sure. But the reason I want to talk about crafting policies that are actually redistributive and that are actually have many co-benefits is because there is some very legitimate resistance to some climate policy that could be regressive, that could be harmful to people, or that could have unintended consequences.
Mm.
And so I think it would be dangerous and disingenuous for climate activists to kind of fight for greenhouse gas reductions above all else.
Mhm.
I always say I'm not, at least I've not seen myself as an environmentalist. I, initially got interested into climate change because I was interested in human rights work and specifically refugee rights work because I lived around the Mediterranean Sea and we had such
Right.
a large refugee crisis there. And that's what led me to wanting to do work around climate change to avoid future forced displacement. And so it's work that we do because we care about people. So we can't get to the
Mm.
point where then we're just arguing about how much GHG greenhouse gas emissions we're reducing without thinking about that. So typically, to get into a bit more concrete things, when you're talking about electrification or when you're talking about changing energy sources, thinking about tangibly if there's even a short term rise in cost before it goes down, who's going to foot the bill? Who is going to be left behind? If there's even a short term job transition, who is going to be left without a job? And typically we think about maybe folks in the oil patch, and those folks absolutely need to be supported, but also all the jobs around them who are often held by racialized people, often racialized women when it's the service industry. So I think those are the type of things that I think we're not doing very well. And certainly I've not seen decision makers at any level of government champion a policy where people could just see, yeah, there's something in it for me to gain right now and in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is like I'm trying to learn as much as possible from reports like this one from the Affordability Action Council, Making Ends Meet, right? That's entirely about trying to communicate how reduction and degrowth are actually not about loss, right? They're about trying to produce something that is more, in many ways, more sustainable,
Yes.
but also allows more people to flourish. That is about, I love this idea of a redistributive policies as opposed to regressive.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of pick up on this thing you mentioned, that like the route that you've taken to climate work, because I talked to Catherine Abreu recently about some of these issues, and like she admitted that she doesn't come to this work from a kind of maybe predictable or somewhat stereotypical attachment to nature,
Right.
right? I'm at the same time like receptive to lots of writing that talks about how entangled we are with the more than human world, right? This is how I access it, is largely through like literature, more or less, like
Mhm.
Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass,
Yes,
where she writes about lived reciprocity and
exactly.
these kinds of ideas. Um, so could you maybe just like expand on that sense of like feeling responsibility to people, um, and how maybe it connects now to the work you're doing around working against what humanity has done to the planet?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I appreciate the way you've kind of laid out like that journey for you because, um, yeah, as I was saying, when I started caring about climate and wanting to take action, it came really from, you know, the fact that I believe in human rights, that I believe in human dignity, and that as someone that grew up in a quite comfortable environment, I never had to fear for my own immediate safety or dignity or access to food or resources. Then I felt like it was my responsibility to make sure others also had that access. And so what led me to climate was realizing, okay, well, climate change will create a threat to everything that makes our life possible, whether it's the stability of our homes, the food, whether it's health and how much climate impacts um, major aspects of our health. And so that was, the initial drive. And then I'm often driven by anger more even than hope at this stage, because once you start learning about climate change, you realize it is not um, a comet from outer space that's going to crash onto our planet. Although that was a good movie, but it's actually something that a handful of people decided to do to the rest of us, um, and perhaps at the beginning not intentionally, but then eventually fully knowing the consequences. Right? We know the fossil fuel industry knew very early on about the consequences of producing and burning oil and gas. We know many politicians understood those consequences decades ago and didn't do anything. And so I think I've landed now into a place where it's anger at the fact that mass suffering was enabled, authorized, signed off on by a handful of people who aren't going to be bearing the consequences, right? Um, I will say though, and for that I'm really grateful for having a chance to do the work that I do now with environmental defense. My appreciation for nature and my desire to connect to nature has really started growing recently. So even when I was doing the youth climate movement, I was still in this very kind of human centered approach to addressing climate change. But in my recent work, because I've worked so closely with mostly indigenous nations, but actually just folks from their various walks of life who came to this problem in many different ways, I've also understood that it's fine to come to the topic from a place of caring for humans or caring for health or caring for, but it is a good thing for us to try to get closer to nature. It is something that is actually in our nature. It is it's something that it's good to reconcile our relationship to nature, and it's I'm now trying, not to pride myself in not understanding or knowing nature, because I think it's something that we should aspire to do. And there's actually a lot of evidence showing that when people connect to a part of nature, that they're much more willing to protect it. So it's also a really important tool for us to fight climate change. But it's also so important for our health and our mental health and feeling grounded and all these things. So I'm also evolving pretty rapidly there.
Uh, Same, right? Like I think gaining a sense of it, slowly but surely, does have a transformative effect, and that there is something undeniable in us, right? That
Right.
knows that we come from it, that we're not separate from it,
Exactly.
right? There's a couple ways that we could kind of take that. I think, like, one is, you mentioned, you've written alongside other Indigenous activists. You've collaborated with Indigenous communities in Canada on climate action. How did you kind of do that in a way that built solidarity while also kind of respecting sovereignty in a sense?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll definitely let my Indigenous counterparts judge whether I've done that properly, but at least the attempt
Right.
from my end. First of all, I moved to Canada 7 years ago, and I moved to Canada with very little prior knowledge of what settler colonialism was, Canada's history. I had a vague understanding of North America's
Mm,
history of colonization, but it's,
mm,
Europe has its own history with colonization that's quite different. And that's not as much the settler colonization. With, for example, North Africa, I was more familiar with those aspects. And so I think I came in and had very little prior knowledge, and very early on, uh, through a few, you know, almost accidental ways at first, right? So the first time I get to university, they do a land acknowledgement, and I'm thinking, that's so interesting. What does that mean? And I look it up, and pretty quickly you get flooded with where that came from, and the
mm,
calls uh, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was it? I forget the exact term. But and so
mhm,
I also I think I benefited from learning very fast about a very shocking situation, because I didn't have time to get a counterpoint that maybe someone who grows up in Canada and is taught about it in a Canadian school. Like, I wasn't. No one was able to tell me, no, no, but it was for. No one was able to really how do I say, excuse it. And so it was very clear when you learn at it all at once how bad, how destructive, how unfair, how unjust all these things are. And so I was very much able early on to say, okay, well, since I've decided to move to this country, it is my duty as a recent settler to do my part and not perpetuating it. And so I think that's what I tried to do. The main ways I think I've tried to approach things are, first of all, recognizing that we need to recognize sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, regardless of the specific nation's position on our issues. So that's something that's been really important. And at Environmental Defense, we've talked about it a lot, is how we aren't for us, respecting a nation's sovereignty isn't conditional on them being on our side. There are some nations that choose to have emissions intensive projects on their land, and we still respect their sovereignty to do that. We might disagree with them on the fact,
mm.
but we disagree with a government. We don't disagree with their
Right.
ability to make that decision. So that was really important to take from a place of sovereignty. And the other one is um, being very honest about our intentions. I think every time I've tried to approach, whether it's an Indigenous organization or an activist or a nation, like a government, I've always said, look, this is what I'm looking for. I'm trying to work on this issue, and it is on your traditional territory. Or I'm trying to work on this issue, and you seem to be having that pollution problem in your community. Would you like to collaborate? So I think being very upfront with intentions seems to have been appreciated, as opposed to in the past, where uh, it seems the environmental movement might have um, been very opportunistic
Mm,
and come in and come out a lot and not really sustain presence. Maybe also come with an agenda, a pre-written script. Hey, we want you in our video and want
mm,
you to say X, Y, Z, instead of asking what's the main thing you want to talk
right.
about right now. So, but all of these things I've learned from Indigenous peoples themselves, and it'd be a very long list if I had to credit all of them. But for sure, some of the folks from Keepers of the Water is an organization that I encourage people to look into, because they've taught me a lot. And then some of the nations that are in Treaty 8 territory certainly, have just through gentle, dialogue, letting me know, oh, this is how things are done, have really helped just correct, some of my obvious biases.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I think about the ways in which, yeah, like the environmental movement, because it's complicated to reach out in some ways from like the perspective of collaboration without like clear objectives, without
Right.
like those kind of expectations, just sometimes hasn't tried, right?
Yes.
And so at the highest levels, it's become the climate movement has become overtly white in
Yeah.
in a lot of different ways. Um, but like the work now to undo that, it seems as though it's happening, and it's hope it's not too late. I think it's like clearly as urgent as it's ever been, if not more urgent. I wanted to talk about this one really powerful piece that you wrote with Tori Kress,
Mm.
who I think is Anishinaabe. And, this is a piece about environmental racism in Canada where, you wanted to speak to how, generally speaking, governments, companies, institutions in Canada will make land acknowledgements, right? Like it's now
Hmm.
customary
Hmm.
for them to make land acknowledgements, use nice words as you put in the article, and make certain promises. Like Justin Trudeau often makes these promises of what you call a better tomorrow for Indigenous people, but then will continue to support what you term a industrial takeover
Hmm.
of Indigenous lands by oil production. And I just think that like really, really clear connection between extractivism, continued building of pipelines,
Yeah.
and colonialism
Yeah.
is crucial. I went to the launch of a book
Hmm.
called "The End of This World"
Yes.
here in Chibuktuk, Halifax, Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia. And Michelle Paul, a Mi'kmaq leader and water protector, talked about the suffering that their chaos creates
Hmm.
and how like there's a lot of power in just telling them no, she
Hmm.
said.
Hmm.
Um, and I wonder if you think that sometimes is what escapes the settler imagination,
Mm.
so to speak. Like, is it just the lack of an understanding of the power of simply telling them no?
Mm.
And what do you think it will take to basically replace the NIMBYism and the resistance to saying no to like subside basically and give way to this greater, solidarity in like opposing it, in saying like just leave it in the ground?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much in every in what you've just said, and that is a very good book, The End of This World. Um,
Mm,
you know, what's helpful to understand, why is it always about resources? Why do we talk about extractivism and Indigenous rights? And we have to remember that the project of colonization in Canada was to access land and to access resources. And so the reason there has been
yeah.
such violence towards Indigenous peoples was because they stood in the way to, access to land and resources. That was the reason there was violence. There
Mhm.
was, you know, mischaracterization of who they are. There were lies. It was to justify a violence in order to. So I think we need to remind that. So to not think, well, environmentalism can be separate from it, at least not in this country. And again, I think because I have the benefit of having seen environmental movements in France, where I'm originally from, there's different struggles there. But I think in this country we can't ignore that tie. Um, I first of all, I've seen a huge evolution. I've seen people who see themselves were originally kind of like the traditional environmentalist, who maybe thought, okay, well, humans have to be separate from nature in order for nature to be safe, kind of mentality, and who've clearly changed a whole lot. So I think there's a very positive change, although slow, in the climate movement. There's also a realization of how much power is held by Indigenous peoples who have been extremely effective at keeping carbon in the ground. I forget the exact number, but I believe it was Indigenous Climate Action or another group that had released this report estimating how much Indigenous resistance kept carbon in the ground. And that's more efficient than many of the policy briefs I must have written, I'm sure. And so, there is that realization. But the other thing I'll say, and I surprise myself sometimes, is to think about like the full, what does it mean to be fully in allyship with Indigenous people? For us, it means giving up a lot of control, right? Like the world in which I operate every day is quite tailored to my needs. Not fully, like I'm not going to say things are seamless in this very unaffordable moment that we're in, or in this still sexist, but overall, it's quite tailored to my needs. So giving up control in order to, share power, and those things are naturally scary. I'm not going to pretend like I don't get scared of them. And to me, the only way to get less scared of them is our education, is learning more from Indigenous scholars, learning more about what were Indigenous laws, to also reassure yourself. Because if you have a void of what it could be if it was different, then of course you're going to go to your instincts, and your instincts are going to be afraid.
Hmm. Yeah, but like the flip side of that is that like this world that is tailored to our needs tends to survive on the basis of the kind of externalizing of
Totally,
so much waste and
totally.
instability and suffering, right? Like, I think about the tar sands, the tailing ponds that you've discussed in your writing. This article called the titled "The Sickening Reality of Tailings Ponds." Like, how many like average Canadians are dwelling with the absolute environmental nightmare of the tailings ponds, which are, as you say, immense lakes of toxic waste created by oil companies in the Alberta tar sands that now contain over 1.4 trillion liters of toxic fluid and sprawl over 300 square kilometers, an area 2.6 times the size of Vancouver. So it's just like a massive toxic waste
Massive.
impoundment
Yeah.
that is just, it's an absolute disaster. And now we know that it's actually much worse than previously thought because of new findings that suggest it could be as much as like 6,300 times more toxic
Hmm.
on the whole.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, these are the kinds of things that the world that has evolved in service of fossil fuels and out of fossil fuels also produces.
Yeah.
It does feel as though this is like a pivotal moment, right? In which this entire ecosystem is under threat by, yeah, like a system of convenience and acceleration. How does that kind of resonate for you in the current moment where so much is under threat? And how is it related to, I guess, like environmental racism as another of these kind of invisibilized, disasters within industrial capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, like the example of the tar sands and the toxic tailings really showcases, but in a super tangible way, the things that otherwise we know were happening, but are maybe not all like concentrated into one place. What we have with the tar sands is, as you said, massive storage of highly toxic waste. Most importantly, what we have is companies that applied to federal and provincial permitting in order to put these there. And if you read every single review, every single hearing, the Indigenous nations of the area, it's in Treaty 8, said repeatedly things like, this is going to contaminate the ground. Said things like, how are you going to reclaim? Meaning, how are you going to clean this up? It's mostly,
Mm-hmm.
either wetlands there or peatlands. These are very complex ecosystems. How are you going to bring those back? And you can see early on that there really was no, credible response to that. Applications were given, permits were given, with honestly no plan to meaningfully clean that up. There were requirements to clean it up. It said you're going to have to clean this up once you're done. But there was actually no
Mm-hmm.
scientifically credible proof. And today, still, we're 50 years after things really picked up in terms of oil production in the tar sands. And still, there is actually no proven solution to the tailings ponds, meaning there is no way to know. There's been no kind of like scientific method that says this is how we can safely dispose of this toxic waste in a way that doesn't keep contaminating for decades and decades. So I think that's the first one is,
Mm-hmm.
that there was kind of a willingness to do a big science experiment on a part of the ecosystem. And I think it's very fair to point out that that science experiment was made in a place that was far away from most of us, and far away from people in power, very far away from Ottawa, very far away from even Edmonton, right, in terms of
Hmm.
political centers. And mostly the people downstream are Indigenous peoples. And so that's where the environmental racism uh, aspect takes place. And someone the other day asked me, I don't understand why you would say environmental racism. What does that mean? And so it's been made clear to me that people understand environmental injustice better than. Um,
Hmm.
but it really means that we are willing to allow pollution more in places, for example, in Indigenous communities or in Black communities, as Dr. Waldron has well documented, than in white communities or
Hmm.
in rich communities. There's also a big class aspect, on top of the race aspect. So the tar sands show that a lot. And I think also the tar sands show our disregard for the treaty and the Indigenous rights that were initially signed. And I'm just going to give that example that um, even today, when an application comes in for a mine or for an expansion of any sort of part of the mine, you have the federal and provincial government sitting on one side of the table, and then the indigenous nations have to basically, the burden is on them to prove why this shouldn't move forward or why this could be bad,
Right.
instead of putting the burden on the applicant, on the industry, to say why this will not be bad, right? And so it's kind of at the very basis of our system of the fact that we kind of assume there's a right to pollute, and someone has to prove why maybe this person shouldn't be given the right to pollute. That's very odd. I don't think
Yeah.
anybody would naturally claim a right to pollute in your everyday life. It seems very dysfunctional, right, as a way to operate.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, like Max Liboiron has written that like it's effectively the case that there is a right to pollute in Canada, especially if you do look at it from their perspective, which is an Indigenous one, that there is like an acceptable threshold of pollution, right? That's playing a dangerous game. Like imagining that there's an acceptable threshold because you're always at risk of crossing this threshold
Yeah.
where like a wetland will be permanently destroyed and can't be brought back, for
Hmm.
example.
Hmm.
Um, but you brought up the legal aspects of it. I mean, this should inspire anger. I think
Yeah,
the scene that you describe,
very much so.
um, and that people like Shiri Pasternak, right, from the Yellowhead
Yes.
Institute, point out that like injunctions as a legal tool are basically a rubber stamp,
Hmm.
right? She says like almost 100% of injunctions filed against First Nations by corporations and government involve resource extraction or development, and they have an 80% success rate with corporations and 90% with provinces.
Hmm.
So I mean, like Indigenous communities, as you say, it's like harder to measure the harm. Corporations can just point to the fact that they will suffer financial harm,
Right.
and the legal system grants them the injunction. But it becomes harder and harder rather than you would think, like, given the level of environmental devastation and climate instability and wildfires and so on,
Yeah.
it would become more possible, right,
Hmm.
for opponents of continued settler colonial extraction to kind of tip the scales against corporate power. But that's not really been the case. I wondered if you had any kind of just general comments on that idea of like these injunctions being largely just a tool of extraction rather than a legitimate legal tool.
Yeah, it's not a topic I know well, but I read that report and thought it was for sure something that um, we'd seen with really high profile cases through the Wet'suwet'en cases that been
Right.
ongoing for years now. And I will say on your latter point about the effects, we are at what I hope is a turning point with more and more, unfortunately, measurable health impacts of both climate change and
Yeah.
fossil fuel extraction, as in like local impacts. You were mentioning earlier that study that found that local air pollution from the tar sands could be up to 64 times higher than initially measured and reported. So we are having more and more physicians, nurses, human health risk assessors saying we can give you,
Right.
a measure of the harm. And I'm quite inspired by the doctors from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment that lately have been, pushing back on some of the false narratives around cleaner fossil fuels like natural gas, and the
Mm.
branding around that being something somehow healthy or green.
I'm so glad you brought this up.
And
Yeah.
they've been saying, how dangerous it is for
Yeah.
folks, how even dangerous it is to have one in your own house, actually, and showing how young children
Mhm.
growing up in houses where there's a gas stove could actually be impacted directly on their lungs, which is terrifying, honestly, and really unfortunate that that's
Mhm.
gets to be politicized when really we're talking about children's health there.
Absolutely. And I like that you brought up like because I've been encountering it here and there, right? It has this kind of tenacious quality, right? The need now to leverage natural gas as like a cleaner fossil fuel.
Mhm.
You know, I constantly go back to Holly Jean Buck's argument in Ending Fossil Fuels about this, that one of the biggest risks, Bill McKibben made this point
Mhm.
too in the wake of COP28, is that we'll start being sold abated fossil fuels or cleaner fossil fuels, and that will just like rather than change things fundamentally, shift things just enough that people can maintain more or less their lifestyles and the kind of just the standard logics and familiar aspects of their everyday lives, right?
Mhm.
Like we understand the effects of CO2 on the atmosphere. We know what 2100 is going to look like if we don't go in a different direction.
That's right.
So there needs to be a disruptive change.
Yeah.
Um, but it's still, I think the threat of natural gas and abated fossil
Yeah.
fuels, for the most part, is that it's going to kind of neutralize the kind of radical energy to
Mhm.
shift in that direction.
On that point, just I think
Please,
what's
yeah.
what's important to me is if we actually had a world in which we could produce and consume fossil fuels in a way that had no local pollution impacts, had no climate generating impacts, and was still economical, we wouldn't be opposed to
Mm,
that. It's not an opposition to the concept of
right.
fossil fuels. It's taking the science that tells us that when you produce and you burn fossil fuels, you're emitting this much, and it's directly causing these impacts. And so, and I said in the cost efficient way because I am sure you can
Mm,
tweak a model and data to the point where if you um, attach enough emissions capturing technology, you might be, at a very expensive price, maybe you might be able eventually uh, to reduce emissions. For now, the technology is absolutely not proven. Just so we're clear, the technology does not work. It does not work at scale, but also it's hugely expensive. And what's much cheaper is
right.
renewable energy, it's energy storage, and in large amounts, it's also energy efficiency and energy sobriety. There is a question
Totally.
also about overconsumption there, but energy
Mhm.
efficiency and renewables and energy storage being much cheaper alternatives than trying to twist and turn in order to just keep the fossil fuel uh, production going at all costs.
Yeah, no, that to me is a really convincing argument. It is not about some sort of like just blind opposition to
Right,
the idea of fossil fuels.
right.
And yet, inevitably we get kind of drawn into politics, right? And there are deep, like, I kind of attachments to a fossil fueled way of being
Yes.
that we do need to kind of confront in a way.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess this kind of does bring me in some roundabout way to this question of tipping points, which I see as having two different sort of valences,
Mm,
right? So like on the one hand, we're never sure with climate change where the tipping points are going to come
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like there are clearly defined kind of planetary tipping points. According to Alice Ma, we've passed like 5 out of 9 of them.
Mm,
So climate change, biodiversity loss, land system change, biogeochemical flows, and chemical pollution are like 5 of the tipping points that planetarily have really already been breached, right? But then we've also, it feels like we've crossed certain social tipping points. What's tricky when it comes to climate action is that we're actively trying to create a future
Yeah.
that is like post a major social tipping point of some sort, you
Mhm.
know? Because like the course we're on, we know how disastrous 2.5, 3, 4 degrees of warming will be. Mainstreaming climate action will mean making it clear that we need to create a situation where within one lifetime we change everything, basically.
Yeah.
And so, like, do you think that language, I guess, of tipping points is useful?
Mm.
Do you think it's maybe too abstract? And like, if this is the framework, then do we ever get to a point where we feel like we've done it?
Right. Right.
Does that make sense? I
Yeah,
don't know if that makes sense.
that makes a ton of sense, and I think that the short answer to me is I wouldn't start with talking about the tipping points to anybody, and I even wouldn't.
Okay.
I would never argue that we have to change everything within a lifetime, because the things that won't change, and actually the things that we're fighting for not to change, is your ability to live a good life, and spend time doing work that makes you feel dignified, or activities that make you feel dignified, and having joy, having the opportunity to so I think the things we're not trying to change are the things that make us enjoy our human experience, right? The things we are trying to change are how
Mm,
we get the energy that we use, because we need energy. We enjoy
right.
the lifestyle we do because we have energy that doesn't just come from our own bodies. So like we need energy. Well, no one's denying that. We need housing, we need shelter, all these things. We need transportation. So we're not trying to change that. That's quite important. And also, I think that the risk with the tipping point language, especially the scientific tipping point, is that it's a really helpful concept scientifically. We should absolutely be trying to identify if there's kind of no go zones. But when you try to communicate them to the public, it ends you end up sounding between a mix of conspiracy theory to complete exaggeration, because inevitably, if you're simplifying a tipping point in a headline, or in a short clip, or even in a long form podcast, you would still have to simplify it to the point where people might say, right, well, if we're past the tipping point on climate change, how am I still here? How am I still
Mm,
alive? And those
mhm,
things. So I think it's quite difficult, and people then think, well, I've been lied to, right? Like people feel like they've been told about climate change for 10 years, and still they're still there. So how bad can it be? And so we end up
mm,
getting into tricky situations where people who initially believed in it are now thinking, well, that was a lie. Someone exaggerated, and now here we are. So I'm cautious with that.
mm,
And instead, I try to explain, that the changes that we're going to see aren't going to be progressive or linear. Things are not just going to be slightly uh, warmer or slightly more chaotic every year. All of a sudden you'll have massive events that could change everything, and so trying to explain things in a bit more plain language. And when it comes to social tipping
mhm,
points, I think one thing that's scaring me right now a lot is that clearly, when it comes to climate, we're actually we could be going back partially. Like I would agree with you that 3 4 years ago in 2019, I agreed that honestly, climate denial was becoming very fringe, and now I'm thinking it's becoming emboldened again, actually, via some other things. But it's really coming back almost as a signal, I don't know if it's like a signal of you being part of a certain identity, a political identity, right? Like, and so
mm,
unfortunately, we're even seeing that come back. But you're also right that for the large part, the majority of people, it's not that they don't believe in climate change, it's either that they've partially given up. I'm hearing more and more people say, at this point, I just don't think we can do much, or people just don't believe governments are capable in terms of actual competent, are not
right.
competent enough to
Yeah.
address it, or that it's not going to be that bad. There's a lot of people also feeling as though perhaps it was overblown. We were panicked for 10 15 years, and clearly, because I've survived up until now, I can survive it a lot more, and that's very misguided when you
Right.
look at the science, of course.
Interesting. Yeah. Tons to kind of chew on there. And I really appreciate the kind of like added thought, like the nuance of thinking about like the communication side of the tipping points argument, because yeah, there is a way in which you do need to actively counter, not through just like downplaying or denying the fact of like reaching these tipping points, these kind of earth shattering, these
Yeah.
like record shattering,
Yeah.
right, changes in the Earth's climate system. You're not trying to do away with the reality of that, but you do need to contextualize it
Totally.
in a way that makes it clear that like every degree of warming matters, every 0.1 degree of added warming matters, and explain why that is,
Yes.
like why it is so important to do the work. But the other thing that I think is really interesting there is like that you need to kind of remind people that we're not really trying to change everything.
Mhm.
That sort of blunt language, which people sometimes will use,
Yes.
right? That in a word, abolitionists will often say, like, in a word, what we are trying to change is everything.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and I think I personally do kind of respond to that like language
Right.
of
Right.
whatever, like deep opposition or
Yeah.
radical disruptive change, but not everybody
That's
does.
exactly
And
right.
as you say, it can inspire a lot of fear.
Mhm.
And this is why I think you wrote the article on the on just transition for the National Observer,
Mhm.
the specific way that you did, right?
Right.
Like this is an article where you're taking apart Seamus O'Regan's
Mhm.
comments about like technological
Right.
wildcards and the just transition. I just thought it was brilliant because like it's 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 still relevant, this article 2 years later, because yeah, it was a moment where I guess O'Regan said basically that we can't risk job loss in the energy transition, and kind of characterize renewables as an uncertain thing.
Right.
But you wrote that wildcards are technologies such as carbon capture, utilization and storage, hydrogen, and small nuclear reactors that could become part of Canada's emissions reduction effort, but haven't been proven to be effective, scalable, or safe. And you say workers and their families deserve a plan that relies on more than pilot projects, especially given the energy transition is already underway. Um, you say there are proven technologies like renewable energy ready to be built that would support real jobs and benefit communities. I spoke with Katja Fennell at
Mhm.
Dalhousie
Mhm.
about this for an article recently, and like she's working on something that kind of falls under the category of carbon capture,
Yeah.
trying to boost the alkalinity of the ocean um, to contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases. But like she's very clear-eyed about how in the end that's going to play a smaller role because
Exactly.
that's expensive,
Exactly.
it's complicated, and ultimately much cheaper and more sensible is just cutting emissions and
Exactly.
switching to renewables. The question is like in writing that article, why did you think it was really important to kind of hit back
Mhm.
against that logic? Like what's kind of dangerous about letting that rhetoric go unchallenged?
Right.
And why is it so hard to get through to the powers that be that like there is a clear path?
I mean, the first one is compassion. I mean, I'm just thinking there are
Mm,
people out there who are taking loans to go to school, who are taking on mortgages based on what they believe is the trajectory of a certain industry. We all make our decisions thinking, well, and so I'm imagining, you know, let's take I'm imagining my younger brother thinking, what if I saw him saying I'm really going to go work in this field, and I heard the minister say that's the future and whatnot, and if I know a fact that tells me actually the International Energy Agency and most major banks, and not that they usually use them as references, but major consulting firms, I mean pretty mainstream institutions, I'm not talking anything radical, are saying actually those are going to
mhm,
play at most a tiny part. I would say, hey, I would advise against it. Why don't you choose a field that has way more chances of being, somewhere where you could find a job, somewhere where you can be who you want to be. And so I think, like, first of all, it's compassion. It's saying, why are we lying to people? Because I know for a fact that the minister gets better information than I do, but at least gets as much information as I do. And so not letting people make life plans or have a false sense of reassurance if we know that that's not true. That's a big part of why pushing back against these false solutions, because carbon capture and fossil hydrogen, not only are they false solutions from climate, but they're the false sense of economic stability. And the fact that we're pumping
Right.
so much of our public money and directing so much of our skilled trades in Canada towards those potential dead ends, I think is terrifying, on top of being honestly morally questionable. So I think
Mm.
that was the first logic. And the second one was, I just think it's important to in this whole thing to stick to the facts, to stick to what we know. If we're going to use the term uncertainty, let's be honest. And I think I did in this article, and if not, I've done elsewhere. Like the own Canadian Climate Institute, which is a think tank that the government set up and has called these technologies wild cards. So let's just not
Mhm.
let's stick to the facts here, and those facts are honestly
Yeah.
pretty clear. And maybe the other thing I want to say is, this appeal to workers specifically is important because I think there are many reasons why building alliances with labor and with workers is important. It's obviously something about those are winning coalitions. We know that unions have a huge amount of power. Recently, they've been showing a lot of that power across Canada. So there's
Yeah.
there's that aspect, but there's also the fact that I think no environmentalist, no climate advocate wants to see communities deserted because there was no planned transition. No one wants to see communities that are currently relying on high emissions industries suddenly being deserted of all their youth. Like we all feel that compassion. Many of us have either relatives or lived experiences and across, either in this country or other countries. So
Yeah.
it's also like it's really that moral imperative that kind of has to that I'm seeing a lot in the climate movement. It was I'm
Mhm.
trying to say. I think perhaps sometimes we're purposefully being portrayed as something different than that, but I'm seeing through colleagues like a deep care and amount of compassion for people who would be impacted by climate action if it's not paired with some good, robust transition policies.
Yeah, and on that topic of care and its connection with climate action, like I've been thinking a lot about adaptation,
Hmm.
climate adaptation
Yeah,
as an act of care.
totally.
Um, but it's not like there are people who are kind of critical of investments in climate
Mm.
adaptation, like people on the left, even
Yeah,
who are like Roman Felli has this book, The Great Adaptation, which says that it's basically, a matter of admitting defeat on some level and consigning almost like whole nations to like a form of, if not total annihilation,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Really, really massive disruption
yeah,
and displacement. Um, and I can kind of see that
yeah,
perspective. It does feel, especially when you consider how little is actually being invested in climate adaptation,
yeah,
like too little, too late.
totally.
But it can also be seen as a matter of like radical care.
Yeah,
We know now that
yeah,
like there are things that we're not going to be able to stop,
exactly.
and we may as well lessen the dam. We might as well lessen the damage. Is that sort of your feeling? Is there any way in which you can see climate adaptation operating almost like a compromise or a concession? Or do you think it really is about like society showing care for people?
I think I really resonate with that tension. Like it is difficult to
Mm,
admit that we will have to adapt to some of it. Partially is because it's admitting some sort of defeat, yes. Also because I think there is a fear in us that if we say let's adapt to, let's say, this degree of or this amount of warming, then people might be tempted to say, why can't we adapt to all of climate change, right? And we know that that's not possible. We know that adapting to 4 degrees of
yeah.
warming is not possible at all. You cannot adapt to such a big change. So I think there's also maybe a fear of almost like muddying the waters, where if you admit that there's need to be some adaptation and some mitigation, people might think, oh, I don't get it, then that means we can
Right.
actually adapt to the thing, so it wasn't that catastrophic. So I think, there's partially that, but I'm
Mm.
entirely aligned with you on the fact that, again, like, the only compassionate thing to do is ensure that there's adaptation, because we know that, like, the sea level is going to rise, and we know that coastal communities, small island states are going to lose land, and like highly inhabited land. We've seen it across Canada
Mhm.
also, like those wildfires, they're real, and not putting money towards
Yeah.
more wildfire fighting um would actually threaten life. So like I'm totally aligned with the fact that we have to care for it. And I think every time we feel a little pinch, thinking, oh, I wish that money that we're putting towards adaptation, or that time, I wish that was spent toward mitigation. Maybe we should use that as a fuel to be, again, angry, and to say, let's avoid having to do that
Mm.
again and again at higher and higher costs, because
Mhm.
again, adaptation is gonna and I'm talking about cost, but I really mean like cost in terms of not just monetary, but like human lives, and just how much
Yeah.
it's gonna
Oh,
take
yeah.
from us. It's not linear. It's not like 1 degree is gonna ask us this much, and then if you have 2 degrees, it's actually it goes up very, very fast. It's completely exponential. um, but I think
Mhm.
it's my attitude to all things is making sure that if you're feeling some sort of tension or compromise, remember that sense of compromise next time you're asking for climate mitigation. Let that fuel you.
Mhm. Well, this conversation has fueled me, in the sense of like giving me like a deep sense of obviously how complex a lot of it is,
Mhm,
but how like there are particular guiding principles
mhm.
that can really like cut through a lot of the kind of noisy complexity of it. Like I'm taking a lot away from this in terms of, remembering it doesn't matter who's in power, for example, remembering that while our democracy might be faltering, it's like kind of worth fighting for.
Totally.
Like I love that comment that, even if it takes longer, it still it still matters that we preserve it. That is to say that democratic sense of collective decision making. And also like the stuff you said around um, communicating with and collaborating with indigenous communities, being upfront with your intentions, and how that, were to be scaled up, could mean a more radical policy of like free and prior informed consent,
Totally.
which we simply don't have, right?
Right. And which we
Um,
need for
you
the
know,
energy
yeah,
transition, right? We can't
yeah,
build our clean economy on projects that have not gotten free, prior, informed consent. That's a big problem we're about to
right.
see happen.
This is it. Like, this is not something that we're even, it feels like, ready to have a conversation
Mhm.
about, which is the siting of so much of the renewable energy infrastructure that, like, we know that we're going to
Yeah,
need in order to meet energy needs, and ensuring that that doesn't happen in a continued kind of colonial extractive way. But it's been a real treat talking to you, and I appreciate it.
well, thanks for having me, and thanks for asking questions that have allowed me to kind of expand my thinking, and just in the span of an hour. It's been really fun for me as well. So